Hi, my name's Jason Green and I look after support and consulting for Atria. In this video, I'm going to provide you an overview of how Atria with a multi-tenant Active Directory can help when you're looking to deploy Windows Virtual Desktop to your customer base. Before we start, there are a few topics I'd like to take a look at just to set the scene. The first of this is take a quick revisit to the standard architecture for WVD and its authentication. We'll also take a look at how Atria fits into the picture with WVD. And then I'll run you through some key points as to how Atria with Multi-Tenant AD actually helps. Then I'll give you a demo of the setup. Okay, so taking a look at the architecture. This is a fairly simple but common layout for WVD. In your Azure tenant, the main requirement is you need to have some domain controllers or Azure Domain Services. This is required for your desktop machines to connect to. They essentially are domain joined to this domain. With that AD and networking in place, you can deploy the WVD control plane at the top here, and you can also deploy then your desktop machines that are used as your session hosts. If we take a look at the authentication flow, when a user connects from their remote clients, they'll first hit the control plane and need to authenticate against Azure Active Directory. Once they've successfully logged on there, they can launch either their desktop or their applications. And when that session is launched, a second Windows authentication happens to connect to the desktop. That authentication happens against Active Directory. So you essentially have two logons happening here against two different directories. To keep those in sync with Azure Domain Services, you obviously get a push from Azure AD into Domain Services. If you're choosing to run domain controllers, then you'll need to look at something like Azure AD Connect to keep it in sync. And you'd also need another VM for that if you're doing Azure AD Connect. So this is WVD in its simplest form. So let's take a look at how that looks when we bring Atria into the picture. So in this diagram we have a typical Atria deployment. We have Atria deployed up here with our web server provisioning and database, and it sits inside a domain with some domain controllers deployed here. This could be in Azure, this might be in your own data center. When you've got your domain deployed, you're going to have at least two domain controllers in the environment, and Atria is going to take care of multi-tenanting that AD. So essentially we're going to be provisioning each customer into the same AD, but they'll be able to share that resource securely. Next, with our Microsoft Online service deployed on our provisioning server, this will keep a sync between AD and Azure AD, so it's going to be synchronizing the identities from the Atria Active Directory and bringing these into each customer's Azure Active Directory. This essentially replaces the need for Azure AD Connect. For each customer's Azure subscription where their desktops will be deployed, we will be VPNing or VNet pairing those networks back to our primary AD. You can use security obviously to ensure those VMs are only talking to AD and not being able to access the network or other networks in any way. The final piece of the puzzle, but is optional, is to have ADFS deployed. ADFS will then make this Atria Active Directory the primary source of truth for passwords. Alternatively, if you didn't want to have this infrastructure set up, you can just use Atria Portal to do the password resets, and that will, at time of reset, set the password the same in Active Directory as well as Azure Active Directory. So that's the overview. And now let's take a look at some key points here. So why is this beneficial to you, and probably more specifically to managed service providers? The first major point is you can share a single set of domain controllers amongst multiple customers. This reduces the number of servers that you need to manage and maintain, and additionally reduces the cost per tenant, which is very beneficial for those smaller customers. By using Atria, you gain the benefits of faster setup. Customers can self-service for creating new users and assigning out the M365 licensing. Your help desk will also have an easier time by using one portal to manage both identities. They don't have to log into multiple places to manage AD versus Office 365 and Azure. As all customers will be joining their VMs to the same domain, you can also take advantage of having common group policies for all customers. And obviously the big one is you're going to have a pricing edge over your competitors. While they'll have to price and include those domain services or domain controllers into every customer's tenant, you can actually share that cost across all of your customers and offer a better price point. Right, so on to the demo. I'll fire up my environment here and we'll take a look over the setup. Okay, so we're going to start the demo here in the Atria portal first. I have a couple of customers configured already. Both this A101 partner and Pied Piper Tech both have WVD deployed in their own tenants. I'll jump into A101 partner here first. Go to users. I'm just going to make a new user. Password temporarily, and we'll provision this user. Now, to give him WVD, he's obviously going to need an M365 license, so I'm going to need to give him our Microsoft Online service. So I will just expand this. He'll need Microsoft 365 Business Premium. Because this is his first time being provisioned to Azure AD, he's going to end up with a temporary password, but we'll reset that in a minute and get those in sync. So add provision. That service is now provisioned to the user. I am just going to jump back to him and give him one more reset on his password, because that will put them in sync between my local AD and Azure AD. Okay, so now we'll take a look behind the scenes at Active Directory and just see what's happened on that side of things. So this is onto one of my domain controllers. I've got two domain controllers in this domain where my Atria deployment lives, DC1 and DC2. These are essentially the domain controllers that WVD will be using when joining session hosts to the domain, and this is also the domain that users exist in. So from Atria, it creates this customer OU, and each customer has their own OU. So if I look in here under user structure, here I can see the users I created and the users that exist for the customer plus my new user that I've created. So the other thing we'll take a look at while we're here is the computers OU. This is where by default new machines will be joined to. So with WVD, when domain joins the machines, they're going to end up in here. You'll need to make sure you've got a unique naming convention for each customer so that the names don't collide. You could also look at redirecting these into another particular OU if you wanted to, and then you can obviously apply group policies to this OU or that other OU, and obviously group policies to the user structure as well. Right, so now we'll take a look at the other side of the puzzle in Azure and see how that looks. So over here in my Azure portal, the first thing we'll take a look at is the networking. So virtual networks. I essentially have a simple basic network currently in West US. This network and its subnets are VNet paired to my HostMe Atria portal network. If this wasn't on Azure, or both sides of the puzzle weren't on Azure, I could obviously use VPNs connections back to dedicated infrastructure if that's where I've got Atria deployed. Once you have your VNet set up, all you need to do for WVD is make sure that your DNS servers are now pointing to my two domain controllers. So these are the IP addresses of those two virtual domain controllers that I had back in my Atria network. And this will be the same for all my customers. They'll use these domain controllers to obviously domain join their WVD session hosts. So now if we take a look back at Windows Virtual Desktop and my host pools, so these are the machines that I'm joining to the network. And if I take a look in here at my session hosts, I can see here this A101P-0 was the machine that I could see joined in my AD. This VM is obviously running up in Azure, and this is where my users will be logging in, but they'll actually be communicating with that domain controller back in my Atria environment. So now if we take a look in Azure Active Directory, I'll be able to see my user that I created, Simon Smith. Here he is with his right UPN. And if I go to groups, because he's been assigned the M365 license, I've made a dynamic group for WVD access. This authenticates users into WVD, so he's already been joined as a member of that group because he has the license, and he'll be able to log on to WVD straight away. Right, so to test out my new user, I'm going to go to the remote desktop web client. And I'll be able to log in here with the user that I just created. Because he's a new user, he obviously wants to do MFA, but we will skip that for now and just get into the portal. So that authentication that just occurred there obviously happened against Azure Active Directory, and now I'm going to launch my session desktop connection, and this is going to be accessing the machine in Azure, but it's going to be authenticating back to Active Directory in my Atria environment. So we can see here it's prompted for a second authentication attempt. So this is the one now going towards Active Directory. So again, I log in with the same credentials. And I'm able to access my desktop. And launch applications. For a more seamless experience, you can obviously use the new remote desktop client. And you can subscribe as your user account to get a more seamless experience when logging onto the desktop. So I'll just use my test account again here. Skip the MFA. This machine's not intended for management by this domain, so just go OK. And again, similar to the web client, we've got our session desktop here that we can run. In this case, it'll be more seamless across multi-screens, so we may see this jump dual screen for a second. And because that desktop authentication is happening again, we can choose the option to remember me so that each time we launch the desktop, we don't have that dual logon. This only happens once. Just bring this into a window so we can see it. And here we've grabbed back our session from the original session that we had in the web client. So that's WVD with Atria in a nutshell. If you have any questions or you want to take a closer look at the setup and discuss it with us, please feel free to get in touch. Thanks for watching the video.